Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and now we will continue our agenda with Symposium, Extending the Evidence-Base of National Education System by Contextualizing Global Benchmarks. The session will be led by a Senior Research Fellow in the Assessment Transformation Research Program at ACER and head of the Global Education Monitoring Center, which drive improvements in monitoring the quality of education worldwide. As an experienced educational researcher with focus on large-scale assessment, she is a major contributor to ACER's technical partnership with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics to develop tools and methods for reporting against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in Education, or SDG 4. To strengthen countries' capacity to monitor learning, she develops and facilitates capacity-building activities and support for large-scale assessment programs and networks such as the UIS Assessment for Minimum Proficiency Levels, OECD PISA 2022 Core E-Country Preparation and Implementation Support, the UNESCO Network on Education Quality Monitoring in the Asia-Pacific, and the People's Action for Learning Network. In 2018, she led the ACER research team that developed the toolkit for the GPE Initiative Analysis of National Learning Assessment Systems. Prior to joining ACER in 2014, she was the National Project Manager for OECD PISA in Austria. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Head Global Education Monitoring Center, Dr. Ursula Schwantner. Joining the convener, we would like to invite also all presenters, Mr. Maurice Walker, Research Director, Assessment Transformation, ACER, Mr. Colin Watson, CEO, ACER UK, Dr. Mark Chetty, Director of National Assessment, Department of Basic Education, South Africa, and Dr. Silvia Montoya will join the stage once again as the discussant for this session. And I leave the floor to the host.
Hello everyone, Salamat Pagi and welcome to this symposium. It's my pleasure to be chairing this symposium on extending the evidence base of education systems by contextualizing global benchmarks at ICAL2024 today. In the next 90 minutes, we will hear different perspectives from major actors in education monitoring about how the global benchmarks of SDG 4 can be contextualized to extend the evidence base of national education systems to achieve quality education for all. Now, this fits also really well with this year's conference theme on learning from evidence, because after all, the goal of adopting these global benchmarks, about which we've heard already before, is really also to enhance the education system monitoring at the national levels, at the regional level, and at the global level. So just let me start with a little bit of background before we move to the different presentations. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, about which we already heard before, were adopted by the UN member states in 2015 as a call to action to end poverty, protect the environment, and to ensure peace and prosperity for all by 2030. Now, halfway into this period, we are still a long way away from achieving important education targets under SDG 4, inclusive and equitable quality education for all. The numbers are alarming concerning children and youth that are out of school, students that lack basic literacy and numeracy skills, and secondary completion rates. Monitoring the progress that countries are making is therefore really important to ensure that these goals are eventually achieved. So how does this work? We've already heard a little bit about this in Silvia's presentation before, but we are really focusing in here on the primary target of SDG 4, which is focusing on relevant and effective learning outcomes. And this is really only one indicator out of the list of the indicators that we saw in Silvia's presentation before. The progress that countries are making towards achieving this target is measured through indicator 4.1.1. So that's really the proportion of girls and boys at 3 different stages of schooling that achieve at least a minimum proficiency level in reading and mathematics. The data for reporting against this indicator comes from many different sources, and most importantly from international comparative large-scale assessments like OECD PISA, IEA Pearls and TIMSS, and regional assessments like SACMEC and PASEC in Africa, PILN in the Pacific, or CRPLM in Southeast Asia. Another important data source for monitoring countries' progress on SDG indicator 4.1 are citizen-led assessments that are household-based and provide information on children who are not attending school and who form an important part of the global children and youth population as well. But as Silvia has pointed out in her presentation before, there is a lack of data for countries that are not participating in international or regional large-scale assessments, and especially at the foundational learning levels, so this indicator 4.1.A, at the end of lower primary school, there is a real lack of data, and you may remember the slide with the map that had the big red areas in different continents. Consequently, we have created solutions that really encourage the use of data from national large-scale assessments for reporting on the global benchmarks, and we will hear more about these methods and how they can be contextualized in a country context in our symposium today. So please join me now in welcoming our presenters. First of all, Maurice Walker will do the presentation on utilizing public good tools and local assessments to determine global benchmarks. Maurice is the Research Director of ACER's Assessment Transformation Research Program. He has a wealth of experience in international and national large-scale assessments, and he is playing a key role in the GEM Center's support to the UNESCO Institute for Statistics for Global Monitoring. Welcome, Maurice. The second presentation will be given by Colin Watson on using the Pairwise Comparison Method to align local assessments with global minimum proficiency levels. Colin is the CEO of ACER UK, and he's also heavily involved in ACER's support to the UIS in developing methods and tools that countries can use to participate in the global monitoring process. Currently, Colin leads the implementation of a grant from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office that supports countries in adapting and enhancing national assessments so that they align with the UIS criteria for global reporting. Welcome, Colin. The third contribution by Dr. Mark Chetty focuses on empowering national education systems, a case study from South Africa. Mark is the Director of National Assessment in the Department of Basic Education, South Africa, and he has been a driver of South Africa's national systemic evaluation, which includes locally developed learning assessments for learners at grades 3, 6, and 9. He is also concerned with setting national benchmarks to enhance the effective use of the data for national education policy in South Africa. Welcome, Mark. And I would also like to welcome Dr. Silvia Montoya as our discussant. You have all met Silvia before in her keynote speech, and we are really pleased to have her in this discussion today, as she brings an important global perspective to our symposium. So welcome, Silvia. All right, I'll hand now over to Maurice to start with the first presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ursula. We're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to stand here and talk today. As soon as I get the technology working. Okay, we'll start from there. Okay, so I'm here today to talk to you about utilising public good tools to help build local assessments. And when I say local, I mostly mean national assessments, but they could be regional assessments, they could be subnational assessments. Okay, this is an international conference. Many of you want to perhaps build a national assessment. How can a focus on global standards help you? First of all, why would we want to prefer national assessments? Well, national assessments are targeted to local contexts. It's really important. They provide evidence for and about the local curriculum, what's going on in pedagogy, and for local policy purposes. And importantly, developing national assessments builds capacity in assessment development in aspects like analysis and reporting as well. Global standards, however, are helpful in that they are generally set in learning areas which are universally accepted as critical for learning. So typically, these are things like reading and mathematics. Importantly, global standards make the results of assessments that incorporate them internationally comparable as long as certain conditions are met. And they can be used as reference points in national assessments. Going back to the reasoning for localised assessments, we only have to look at the contextual challenges, many of which have been talked about in presentations so far. So language, we talked about that earlier today, especially in the early years. And then there's a whole raft of policy issues around equity and inclusion that are possibly better addressed in a local contextual assessment than in one that is imported from another country. And there is also local curriculum priorities to think about. So we might want to assess reading and mathematics, of course, but we might want to assess some other things as well, which might not be present in, for example, large-scale international assessments. So we might want to also assess, STEM subjects or some of the essential skills for learning around critical thinking, creative thinking, and so on. So I'm going to talk to you today about a tool that has been developed. It's a tool that is from the UIS and ACER has helped develop that tool, which is the Assessments for Minimum Proficiency Levels, or AMPL. So this is an assessment tool for applying benchmarks which are derived from the local, from the global standards, and the global standard is that one that we've been talking a lot about this morning, the SDG 411. They apply these standards to education monitoring data to provide policy insights to ultimately improve education and improve learning. So the assessments for minimum proficiency level, AMPL, It's a tool, and you can use it as a standalone assessment. So you can take the assessment and implement it, and you can get results, and you can get reported on the SDG standards. But you could also integrate AMPL into a national assessment, either as a whole booklet, integrated in a whole form design, or more complex, rotated through national forms. And it's these later two types of use of the AMPL which will really help drive the quality of the development of any national assessment. So the idea is that a country, a system, can evolve over time by firstly starting off with a formal program of undertaking the AMPL, where the AMPL is administered alongside a local, national assessment. And then there's a process where the two assessments are statistically linked. So there's some psychometric scaling is undertaken. And then once that happens, the benchmarks that are present in the AMPL assessment can be transferred to the local assessment scale. Now this might happen immediately after one assessment, or it might happen over time. So at T1 we have the linked assessment, but by time 2, maybe time 3, maybe time 4, what we have is a high quality local assessment product, ensuring that this local assessment meets the UIS eligibility reporting criteria, which Silvia alluded to earlier today. And I'll just speak very briefly about those. So the UIS has developed eligibility criteria, and as you can see from these range of 7 criteria here, they really focus in on that pillar, or both of those pillars that Silvia mentioned, one around construct coverage and the other one around procedural quality. So you can read those areas. Okay, and participating in a formal AMPL where you undertake the AMPL alongside a national assessment, for example, does build capacity in national assessment teams. So there are informal capacity development opportunities because you're actually working with people, you're supported by an international organisation to help you with the sampling, the data management, and so on. But in a formal AMPL program, there are also opportunities for formal capacity development, and so there are modules offered around objective measurement, item response theory, all these sorts of things that we're all gathered here in this conference to talk about. Okay, so really what the AMPL does in both a formal and informal way is provides support tools and methods to nations that do want to report against the SDGs. So it does provide the assessments and the questionnaires to support the reporting, but also to, as I said, to report the development of the national assessment programs. It provides technical standards, blueprints, really quite a wide range of resources, right down to the item parameters and measurement models that you could use. And the point here is that the provision of public goods is aimed at supporting educational jurisdictions to utilise the tools and methods independently. Now this might not happen immediately, but it might happen, well, it should happen over time. So the advantages to using the AMPL to support the development of your national assessment program are that the AMPL is a public good tool and there are supporting materials. And these materials are high quality and the procedures are also high quality. It's linked to the SDG benchmarks, already linked, so you don't have to do a benchmarking exercise. It builds capacity in technical areas. It can improve technical aspects of the local assessment program, and importantly, it can transfer the benchmarks from an assessment that's already calibrated and benchmarked to the local standard, global standards, to the local assessment context. And importantly, it becomes redundant when the linked local assessment program, the national assessment program, is built to meet the criteria of the UIS eligibility reporting standards. So it's not something that you need to do forever. I want to finish with just a couple of slides of the great data that you can get out of programs like this. So we administered an AMPL in Zambia last year, and these are the results of it. So in Zambia, they administered at both grades 4 and grade 7. Now they had slightly different assessments, but they were vertically linked, and this enables us to report on the same scale. So you can see here, does this work? So there's a couple of features about this. So on the left is mathematics, and on the right is reading. I'll just look at the mathematics. You can see the distribution of the grade 4 children here, and you can see that most of the grade 4 children fall below the MPLA standard, which is the minimum proficiency level for end of lower primary. And you can see that in grade 7, most of the children are falling between the MPLA standard and the MPLB standard, which is the one for the end of upper primary. So a couple of things to note about this graph, though, is that this does demonstrate some growth. There is growth between grade 4 and grade 7. That's fantastic. We expect that, and that's great. But another thing that this demonstrates, and this goes back to some of the graphics that Jeff presented yesterday, is the extreme amount of variance that's in both populations. So you see this grade 4 population here. Although most of the children are falling below the MPLA standard, there's a lot that are meeting it, and there's some that are even extending up to meeting the minimum proficiency level for upper primary. And of course, conversely, for the grade 7 population, there are actually a lot of children in grade 7 who are not meeting the minimum proficiency level of end of lower primary. So this is really important. It's a powerful policy data. This really helps track monitoring learning progression, at least in cohorts or across grades over time. Finally, I just want to say, of course, this same sort of data can be used for unpacking equity issues as well. So I've chosen gender here, but there could be other subpopulations. I've magnified it so you can see, for example, that there is a difference between girls and boys' distribution in mathematics in this particular population. So basically, what my call to action, if you like, is that we do need to get it right. We need to have solid benchmarks, and we do now have really tightly defined global benchmarks. The technical criteria for reporting against SDG, we need to adhere to those, and they help us build robust assessment programs. And there is no reason why using these global standards cannot help us adapt to the local context and eventually be reliant on our own national assessment systems to report against the global standards. So in summary, we can use global standards and local tools together to understand learning progression and to address equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice. We'll now hear from Colin about the Pairwise Comparison Method.
Yes, so I'm going to talk about the Pairwise Comparison Method as a way of aligning local assessments with global minimum proficiency levels, because the process that Maurice was talking about, administering another assessment alongside your national assessment, can be an expensive process. And in some countries, they don't feel that they have the resources to do that additional assessment as well. So although it may be the gold standard to do statistical linking, countries were looking for other methodologies that may enable them to do something similar, and the pairwise comparison approach is the one that we have proposed. So I'm going to talk through the process, but I'll start with a little bit of the theory before getting on to how it's being used in operational delivery. I won't talk about these very much because they were mentioned by Silvia and again by Maurice, but obviously in order to do any of this sort of work, we need to make sure that the national assessment that's being used is of sufficient quality and meets these criteria, so that process must happen before any attempt to link to global standards is made. The other thing that we need to know about is the learning progression, because the pairwise comparison method is based on this understanding of a learning progression. And you've got a sort of definition there of a learning progression about descriptions of the successively more sophisticated ways of thinking about a topic that can follow one another as children learn about and investigate a topic over a broad span of time. So what we're trying to do with a learning progression is understand the sort of what does it look like to get better in a particular element of a subject. And so ACER has developed a learning progression, starting talking about the domain, the big picture about the learning area, and then breaking that down into levels of description, both in strands with illustrations of what those strands tell you. So this idea of a learning progression, what does it mean to get better in mathematics or in an element of mathematics, is something that we've developed. And we've developed that using empirical data, so using information from items that have been administered to children that help us to understand where on that learning progression different elements of the curriculum might be placed. So what we end up with is a scale. And on that scale, we are able to identify, as Maurice showed on the ample diagram, where MPL A, B, and C sit, so that we can understand what sort of learning progression scale score you would need to achieve to meet those minimum proficiency levels. And so the pairwise comparison method uses this. It uses the fact that we've got a set of items already that have been linked to this learning progression scale. Here they're shown in blue, and we know on that scale where the minimum proficiency level is. So you can see that items 1, 2, 3, and 4 are above the minimum proficiency level, and items 5, 6, and 7 are below that minimum proficiency level. So we've got that set of items about which we already know information. And we've got a set of items. Here it says ample items, but it could be a local assessment set of items. But we don't know where they fit on the scale, so we want to try and match them into this same scale. Now, we could do that statistically, as has happened with AMPLE, but actually we're trying to look for another way to do that, and that's where pairwise comparison comes in. So what happens here is that you get a group of judges to compare different items. So in this case, you can see that item 1, which is a blue item, so it's from, it's already on the learning progression scale, is being compared to item A, and item 2 is being compared to item A, then item 3, then item 4. And what happens, you can see from the picture there, is that a judge will be given those 2 items and be asked the question, which one is more difficult? They will make a decision about which item is more difficult. And they will keep being presented with pairs of items to answer that same question, which of these is more difficult? And then you can use those judgments to match the items from the new assessment, from the national assessment, onto the existing scale. And so now we can see that items A, B, and C are above the MPL, similar to items 1, 2, 3, and 4. And items D and E are below the MPL, similarly to items 5, 6, and 7. So we can map the items onto the same scale using those judgments of those experts. And we can also then determine what the cut score, the benchmark would be on that national assessment that aligns with that minimum proficiency level. So without having to do statistical linking, we're still using statistics, but we're using the judgments of experts in order to try and make sure that we can get those items onto that learning progression scale. So what's the advantages of this? Well, it's cheaper. You know, you don't have to get lots of children to take an assessment, and it's faster than statistical linking methods. The panelist training is simple and doesn't require extensive preparation. It's a relatively easy question to answer. You're not asking how difficult is this item, which is quite a difficult question to answer, but you're making use of the fact that people are better at comparing things. So which of these is more difficult is an easier question to answer. It can be implemented consistently. It can be done online, and so therefore that can be done quickly using panelists from across either a country, a region, the world, and you can get lots of people involved in making those judgments to get some understanding of consistency globally. And over time, we're adding more and more items onto that learning progression scale, so we're getting a better sense in all countries of the sorts of items that children are being faced with and where they fit on that learning progression scale, and that will over time create a great source of material that can be used by test developers, people designing new assessments. We do have a limitation. I'm not going to say everything is perfect at the moment. At the moment, this has only been done in English. And so the learning progression scale and the items that we've used have been in English. But we are hoping this year to expand this. I've already had a conversation about whether we can do something in Indonesian to try and see whether we can take this approach and match it to other languages, because obviously most assessments in the world are not done in English. So we're suggesting this as a methodology, and it's one that UIS are accepting as a methodology because there is this external validation against something that's already been linked to the global proficiency levels. But we've done some studies alongside this to try and make sure that the approach is working. So here's a couple of outcomes from those studies. There's more information online, as you can see the link there. But first of all, it's about, well, these judges are making decisions about what is more difficult, but how good are they at doing that? And one way we can check that is the items that were already on the learning progression scale. We know where they are on that scale. We know the order in which those items appear in terms of their difficulty because we've got that evidence. And so we can compare the scale that comes from the judges to that original scale that we have for the learning progression. And you can see there we got a 0.96 and a 0.93 for reading and mathematics. So they're really quite good at creating a similar order, item order, for those items. So that gives us some confidence that they're making good decisions. And we also want to know, well, is this judge dependent? Do judges, different group of judges, would they come up with a different set of outcomes? Because that's important, given that we're not going to be using the same people to make judgments every time. And so we've done this with 2 different sets of judges, and again you can see 0.97, 0.94, good correlation between those 2 groups making those decisions. So we think this can give confidence that this methodology, although it may not be psychometrically as sound as doing a statistical linking, but it is good enough for the work that we need to do to give that sort of level of data that is required. So, what happens if you want to do this? Well, a toolkit has been developed that explains the process you need to go through in order to implement PCM. That's available online. It will be updated shortly, but only with some minor adjustments. You want to make sure that each item is seen by about 40 judges, or been involved in 40 comparisons, just to make sure that you're getting enough information about it. At least 15 judges in an exercise to make sure that you've got a range of people. More desirable, but obviously cost comes into that. Each judge doesn't necessarily need to make all of the comparisons. You can split them up. And as I say, the exercise can be done remotely. So Ursula mentioned that we're doing some work at the moment with some countries funded by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and we are taking their national assessments, making sure, working with them to make sure that they meet the quality criteria so that we can employ this methodology and report against SDG. So this is being used out in the field currently as a way of trying to meet the requirements. And I think that is all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colin. And now over to Mark to tell us more about your experience with contextualizing the global benchmarks in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks, Ursula. And let me start by saying Om Wasti Astu. I hope I said that right. And so there's a deal here that I promise to speak fast if you promise to listen fast. So I got a lot of slides, so I'm hoping to get through. But Colin has given me 3 minutes and Maurice a measly 30 seconds. But I'll try and utilize that. So, okay, so given what I've heard over the conference, I adapted the title slightly, but it's the same messaging, to sort of speak about global standards through a local, national context. So, presenting a view from a developing country context often comes across as a little bit strange sometimes. You're sort of battling against the odds, but we try and find, and as Maurice has said, sometimes it's possible to do a hybrid between global standards and national assessments. Sometimes it poses challenges. So, but I'll try and give a sort of South African perspective on how we sort of seeing these things play out in our country context. So, some general comments on standards that we think that often come to play. There's a pull factor. We often look at SDG goals influencing assessment standards, but often assessment standards influence policy goals. And sometimes it can direct the system. Governments become obsessed with the assessment standards. So, and often sometimes it can lose track of the policy goals. So there's a big pull factor. Also, Jeff sort of inspired me by his 1869 slide to look at how assessment practice actually has unfolded through changing times? Well, actually, not much. From the 19th century, when schooling became formalized, to the 20th century, to the 21st century, whether you're in Asia, whether you're in South Africa or Africa, it's pretty much the same thing. It's assessment of content knowledge, mastery, reproduction. And it hasn't really shifted. So what does that pose for us as an international community in terms of sort of redefining standards? We kind of made the move from, paper to digital. Some of us are still at paper, but it's still based on the same kind of mode, although we've changed the mode effects, but the principles behind the assessment standards have relatively, unchanged. So that creates some tensions for the generating and localizing of standards. Now, in South Africa, we have what we call an evolving national assessment framework. So anybody here who's bored, you don't feel that you got enough work to do, please come. We got a lot of work to do in the assessment space. So this is our landscape, and it keeps changing because we keep adding things. So, we have strong examinations culture, standards are well defined, but when you talk things like formative assessment or learning pathways, these are new. And these are where we're trying to explore the generation of standards so that we get a broader perspective of judging learners. But my attention today, otherwise I'm going to take the whole day, is to focus on the systemic evaluation that we run as a ministry, and to give you some insights about how we're looking at localizing standards through that process. And if time allows, I'll touch a little bit on our general education certificate, which is a kind of new sort of pathways assessment. What that is doing, it's allowing us to tap into holistic standards. So now, in terms of just some commentary on global standards, I won't have time to unpack these, but these kind of 5 aspects are, the general benefits. And we as countries, even developing countries, we tend to benefit a lot by having these standards. They give us a kind of reference point. So how it gets utilized, though, is important. And knowing the sort of theory behind the global standards, as Silvia has explained in the morning session, is very critical, because attached to that is identity and agency. And as government ministries, we want to know what is the identity behind what the research programs or the statistics that are required. We sometimes sit there, why is this statistics needed? Who needs this? Why are we reporting to UNESCO? What are they going to do with this data and so forth? So, sometimes it's that context that gets lost. But one of the critical benefits is partnerships. And we've, as South Africa, enjoyed quite a critical partnership with ACER. And in that landscape, as we sort of looked at delving deeper in some of our assessment programs, we looked at that kind of expertise that's lacking in the country to see how we can sort of lift our national assessment programs to reflect the global standards. But there are challenges. Authority becomes a very critical one. Who sets the standard is often just as important as the standard itself. And often as developing countries, you kind of already standardized. Does that make sense? You're already in the space where the standards are determined, and you're working off that kind of deficit narrative. You're always playing catch up. So Africa is always playing catch up by the global standards. And sometimes that can hurt us as a local country. We take a lot of battering from our media. You're not reaching the local standards. Your children are not reading for meaning by age 10, or they're not thriving by 5. Who set these standards? Where do they come from? I heard the speaker talk about local languages. How much has that played a role in terms of competency and proficiency? So there are challenges. But in terms of the systemic evaluation, this is our model, and we've tried to embrace the complexity of standards generation, that it's not just about those scores, those achievement scores. There's a whole system, and Jeff spoke about developing a world-class learning system. So there's intricacy, there's layers, there's complexity in those activities that unpack what happens in the learning system. So, we've kind of adopted that model, and together with our teacher unions, we came together to say, look, let's shift the analysis beyond just the learner. What's happening at a system level? Could be that your policies are constraining the learning performance. It's not just about what the learners and the teachers are doing in the classroom. So it's multi-layered and it's complex. And we've kind of tried to unpack that in our systemic evaluation model, so much so that working with ACER and doing a lot of conceptualizing, and I just love throwing psychometricians under the bus. They come with very lovely statistical models, and we say, okay, how do you evaluate the system as a unit of analysis? It's not scripted, you can't do that. But for us as a country, we want to look at the whole system, because we got so many transformative agendas at play: diversity, equity, access. These things sometimes in homogeneous populations, they may not be so relevant, but in a developing country context like South Africa, it becomes very critical to look at that layers and still look at the impact on learning outcomes. Okay, I need another day if you want to understand that. But it helps us generate evidence in a more meaningful way for policy interventions and support. So responding to the SDG goals in a way, we do it at grades 3, 6, and 9. These are our key stages. We do it in mathematics and reading literacy. So in a way, we're using those proxies, but we're using it in a model that's giving us more sort of comprehensive system data. Now, in terms of reporting, and we're just very proud that, like Indonesian team, kudos to you. In about a few weeks' time, we'll be releasing 3 volumes of these, and each one is like about 200 pages. It's such a wealth of data, from learning levels to learning progression to proficiency to system support. Now, I don't have time to show you all the results of that because it's more about standard setting today. But in terms of the progression levels, together with ACER, and I think, Jeff, you'll be proud to know that in the systemic evaluation, we're looking at that continuum. We're looking at putting mathematics and reading literacy on a common scale across multiple grades. So that helps us to locate learners, on this kind of common scaling. Where are they? If they're not at the grade 6 level, then where are they? And what kind of competencies are they showing? So, and that shows, helps us to investigate where the gaps are in terms of the progression on that continuum. So we're looking at our 3 grades over time, because it's also a trend study. We're looking at learning progression and individual grade levels, but also as these cohorts move. So we conducted the baseline study in 2022. Our next one is next year in 2025, and that will also help us with those grade 6 learners will be at grade 9, and the grade 3 learners will be in grade 6. So it's going to give us good cohort data to look at how learning progression is happening over time. These are just results in terms of reading literacy and the mathematics. It helps us to also check, that percentage of learners that are overperforming and those percentage of learners that are underperforming across these different grades. Okay, but we also found that these are good for policymakers and at a system level, but at a classroom level, they can become a little bit less efficient and the utility. So we had to go deeper into learning proficiency. And this can resonate more with teachers on the ground from a practitioner point of view. So we developed 4 levels of proficiency, again, very similar to the Indonesian team. Obviously, our psychometricians have been talking, and it's not a coincidence that they studied together. And so we've got these 4 levels, and emerging, evolving, enhancing, and extending, and that sort of gives us a sense of how to sort of get to an understanding of minimum proficiency and acceptable proficiency. So, but what the team has done through that standard setting process, got content experts after using the plausible values and the scaling and the cut scores that were established from the study, then went further to map it to the curriculum in terms of descriptors, but also they looked at what were the pedagogical implications as well as the level of support, so that when we can display the results, we could also give the results, but also say to the system, this is the level of support that you need to do, and these are the pedagogical actions. So it's like trying to close that gap at a classroom level. Okay, so, and we can do that at all 3 grades. I'm just flagging one of them here at the grade 6 reading literacy, and then we can classify learners into these 4 categories, and you'll notice if you're sharp enough that in South Africa there's a significant number of learners not meeting, or are still at the emerging or evolving there. But we're trying to take a positive growth stance to say even these learners, unlike in Tims and Pearls where it's difficult to say what they can do, here we're acknowledging that each of those learners, even though they're not at the appropriate grade level, are showing some signs of learning. And it's a start point for the teachers to further develop and grow, and for policymakers as well. We can disaggregate it across our 9 regions so that we get a comprehensive view. I gotta go faster, the red clock, I don't know who's controlling the time, but obviously it's not South African time. But in terms of school effectiveness, we're also looking at the Ofsted model in the UK. These 9 focus areas then gives us to delve deeper into standards about context. Because again, learning proficiency, progression level still doesn't complete the picture. So almost on a qualitative case study basis, and a subsample of schools, we investigate these 9 areas, and they're all about the school effectiveness or school climate, and we can unpack each one of them into sub-criteria and look at the evidence around that. It's a very thorough investigation at the school level, and we can generate very critical observations. In South Africa, basic amenities are very critical. You can talk about literacy and numeracy, till you're blue in the face, but if children don't have water and electricity, they don't have food when they get to school, they're not going to perform well in the test. So sometimes the global standards doesn't really take that kind of context into consideration. So, and we can generate scores, we can look at a provincial level, through factor analyses and other forms, where is it? Very quickly as I end, and I see there's 30 seconds, our general education certificate is a new innovative program in which we're bringing this more differentiated, holistic standards to the fore. So these are 15-year-olds, it's technically the end of compulsory schooling. So beyond grade 9, they can choose an academic or a vocational or an occupational stream. But we're trying to follow a more inclusive, differentiated approach. Again, working with experts from ACER, Dr. Teo and team, we were able to come up with a model that still takes the subject knowledge skills, but adds these broader general capabilities. And we've added an inclinations assessment. So we're trying to generate a holistic framework in which we can then give a better picture to parents and children about their holistic skills. So we're very excited about, this holistic dashboard and the holistic report card that we're going to generate for the children. And we're going to feel that it's going to be a more inclusive, because lots of the children who are not academically inclined often get marginalized and get labeled, hey, you're not smart. So, that's the end of your school work. So, in conclusion, let me say that if the world is fast changing, and we know it's rapidly changing, AI and so forth, surely the assessment standards approach should also change. Assessment practice should change as well. Otherwise, we lose the relevance of what we're teaching our children in schools. Instead of just being good at tests, we need to teach them real-world skills. And in a way, we're asking the psychometric community to also look at redefining norms. We know children have diverse skills and talents, and we try to box them into robots. You all must come out the same. And kind of the standard setting sort of presupposes that robotic output and loses the diversity, of where our children are. So these are the last sort of takeaway points that I can leave you with. I won't go through all of them, but it's to just sort of summarize that standards only have utility and value when it's meaningful to the country context. And this is enhanced through more standardized local national assessments rather than, global standards. Although maybe there is room for hybrid. But we've tried to do these things in order to establish how we can get more meaningful standards in the system. So we always say in South Africa, let's shoot for the moon. Let's not be scared of change. What have we got to lose? And so that we can reconstruct the assessment landscape. I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for sharing your wealth of experience and guiding us through your perspective for South Africa in such a speedy way. Thank you very much. And now over to Silvia for some discussion of the presentations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And the good news, I don't have a slide for this, so I think that's fine. I will not try to use all the time, but let me actually reflect. I get the sense that we have been hearing the same, a little bit, some provocative discussion about the, the standards, and I think I will go back to the, and in the context I cannot think in a different way than having the SDGs as a reporting and what are the global standards that we are setting within that, at least regarding content, and a little bit of the history there eventually was not that, it is not that clear enough. Some of the international tests and the regional tests are based, you know that the process of defining the proficiency levels and to some extent what are the minimum eventually within each of the assessment is based on the mapping of the curriculum and the assessment frameworks of the countries who are participating in those assessments. And in some cases, these are very heavily influenced, and some assessments have started it with a group of countries, in general by the group of developed countries. They have actually are to some extent tied to those original actually mappings, and a little bit less flexible to try to embed some of the developments that happen in the country who originally didn't have part of that. And some of them are very heavily regionally contextualized. This explains why, especially in primary education, there are so many regional assessments. If you go to the assessment framework of the Latin American countries, it's different from the assessment framework of some of the African assessments, which are adequate for the context of the countries and the curriculum of the country who are participating in those assessments. So as part of the SDG process, we have tried to detach from taking as a reference. Obviously, we have taken advantage of those progresses, but we have taken the extra work to go over mapping many of the countries who are basically in the global south, which assessment and curriculum framework have not been included as part of this global and regional initiative. We were not participating in the global, and in some of the cases they were not having any regional assessment there. Though that explains that in the process of reporting, the minimum proficiency level to some extent in early grade, which is at the end of third grade ideally, which is the end of the lower primary, the minimum proficiency level is actually located trying to take the minimum between grades 2 and 3, so it's more the level which is in second grade. And at the end of primary is a proficiency level which is more identified at the 5th grade, which is the year before in general, the end of primary, which 9 out of 10 countries in the world are ending primary in the 6th grade. I have that data because it's part of the data that we collect. So basically what I try to point out is that that minimum proficiency level that we're taking as a reference point, and it could be considered for this a global standard, is to some extent the result of that mapping of 150 countries, where at the end of the day are represented almost most of the countries who are, and they have been taken into care that, which are a reference point that is the same that when you take your child to the doctor, and then eventually they have a scale and they define which is a minimum and the maximum, for instance, height or weight that you have to do that. So your child could be in the middle, they could be in the upper bound, or they could be in the lower bound, but what the doctor cares is within the interval, the confidence interval of that weight. And to some extent, the concept that we have asked about the minimum proficiency level is related to that set of parameters, which are not related to an assessment in particular. So I think that the example that we have been hearing about two tools and the way to benchmark and the example of Mark are within that framework, that actually you are trying to identify within your local context And the local context go to a very important point of the way we have tried to frame, and for this reason, we think that the national assessment are the way, and the agenda is trying to identify within your national tool, ideally, which is the level of the minimum proficiency level. But still then you have to go back to your language, to your context, to your curriculum, to your teachers, to your system. And then I really like the presentation of Jeff yesterday and the 4 slides. His slide has been my favorite. It's very few lines in the slide with very few key ideas that were this connection between the curriculum, the practice, the teacher, the learner, and the learning there. And I think that this is to some extent the codification between that global standard and what happened at the context level, at the national level. So for this reason, we're really promoting to try to have cases that the national tool is used and is used to reporting, subject to actually to prove that the child is acquiring those skills that are needed, because less than that is actually proven that there is no way to progress. A child that cannot identify a simple understanding, a sentence, a short sentence, in 2nd or 3rd grade is very unlikely to be progressing in a good way to develop critical thinking, to be able to articulate and to understand his right or her rights as a citizen, to try to understand a very simple health instruction, or to address the climate change issues and to try to eventually separate the trash in different categories, because simply if you cannot read, you cannot identify, you cannot exercise any aspect of the life. So to some extent, what we have tried to avoid is to try to go outside that, and I think that the main message is to try to stand and to take away from this presentation is that we have, and this discussion is that we have that reference point that is not obliging to take any tool in particular, but what is actually requesting is that you have a good balance to weight the weight of a child. You really need to get a good information, because if not, you don't want to be undernourished and you want to prevent the progress of our life. And to some extent, we are living with that, and we're accepting some of the parameters that are fixed in many areas of our life that actually are based on that guidance. But at the end of the day, how you go back and you take that recommendation forward needs to be related to the local context, to that articulation with the teachers, with that articulation with the curriculum, with that articulation about the equity dimensions that are more relevant in one context than in other contexts. Because in some countries the problem is socioeconomic diversity, in some other countries is the equity dimension, in some countries is a race dimension, and then at the end of the day, but still, regardless of those characteristics, the child needs to be actually, in all the curriculums that have been mapped, it has been an agreement of those contents and skills that are reflected in the minimum proficiency level. So to some extent, this is a reflection of what the group of countries are saying that the child should be achieving in that curriculum. So the question is that why this is not happening, and to some extent the way to solve those problems is actually contextualized to the local context. And I think that what has to be clear is that there are tools that are allowing to some extent to find a way to use your national tools in order to identify what is happening with those minimum parameters that are trying to say to these tools. So that will be my all comment in this way, and thank you so much to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silvia, for your discussion. We would now like to open the floor for some questions, and we've got one right over here. Thank you. Do we have people helping with microphones? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say in Louis Armstrong words, what a wonderful world when it comes to implementing global benchmarks. Sorry, my name is Sahbi. I'm from Tunisia. I work and live in the UAE, Abu Dhabi exactly. I have a gloomy idea about implementing global benchmarks, and my question is to all of you. I'm thinking of these ideas and concepts of applying global benchmarks, the cultural relevance of these benchmarks to the local context. Relevance and the training. I think one of you talked about teacher training and you said that it's something easy and cheap. I don't agree. It's time consuming. It requires a lot of effort. And it's real pain when it comes to teacher training who have one view of life, one view of learning, and it takes much time to change their conceptions of learning, assessment, and all the cultural aspects. What about equity, social justice? Mark, you talked about South Africa with kids who do not have food. In Tunisia, we have the syndicate people who are always blocking things. When it comes to training, teachers do not have computers. Teachers do not know how to be in full control of the local standards, let alone the external ones. Fairness, access, you talked about all these. Assessment standards. I think, and let's be frank here, testing organizations are behind this. Knowing that testing organizations generate billions and billions of dollars every year. And we know that we have this idea of the Common European Framework of Reference, Canadian language benchmarks. Now the Chinese have their own references as examples of benchmarks. I know we're talking here about the United Nations, and I don't see the United Nations standing out or being different from the Common European Framework of reference. And my last point is resistance to change. You're talking about countries where it's not easy to give up on their culture. I have not seen any presenter talking about calibration of the benchmarks to the local context. And that's the weakest area when it comes to implementing, for example, the Common European Framework of Reference, Canadian language benchmarks. I would like to know your input on this, on how to calibrate, how to respect the local culture, and how to empower these countries. I see it's a little bit difficult. You preserve your own culture, but at the same time, adopting a new culture. That's my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. An important question about the relevance of the global benchmarks for local contexts. Who would like to respond or make a comment? Yeah, Maurice? Yeah.
I'll attempt to address that. I think you made some good points around teacher training, and I think I would leave that to Colin to comment on with regard to the methodology that he presented here. However, I think that one of the points that we've been trying to get across is around respecting local content. When you ask how can we calibrate taking into account the local context, I think that what we're suggesting in a hybrid situation is that we do calibrate using the local context. I mean, we would advocate, as in South Africa, for example, the development of national assessments that reflect the local context, that do take into account your specific issues, perhaps around language. That's a common one, and but also incorporating what Silvia has explained as being these global minimum standards, which are simply around reading and mathematics, and that can be done in the way that you want to do it, or that the country wants to do it. So that's how we would calibrate, if you like, to respect the local context. So it's basically taking the local context and local content and overlaying the global standards and calibrating those together. And as I tried to point out in my presentation, that once that initial calibration is done, if your goal is to report against the SDGs, then you can continue with the assessments that have been developed in your local contexts without further reference to any external assessment items or anything like that whatsoever. I hope that's partly addressed your point. Would you like to say something about the teacher training?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. So I was trying to make the point about the pairwise comparison method and the experience we've had of training participants in that is easy. I wasn't trying to explain that training teachers generally in assessment or any of these areas is easy. That's obviously a much bigger deal, but actually training people to say which of these two is more difficult is a much easier task and can be done quite quickly.
Yeah, well, maybe I could add, and thanks, Avi. I think, so Tunisia in the context of South Africa would be very similar, where, we got to be aware of, even in the design, and I think you're saying that's a start point, of the instruments, of the standards, that culture, identity, issues that are local, in the local context. How do you find ways to bring it into the psychometric space? And not easy, because when I spoke about also a learning theory, I think it was touching what you were also referring to, because there is an identity that universal standards kind of, have a common start point, and it's probably not true. So as you dwell deeper into the learning theories, you find that many of the psychometrics, the calibrations, the instrument development are based on very behavioral, cognitive, psychological learning theories. And as a country, one has to ascribe to that, and therefore the measurements then sort of make sense. But if you don't ascribe to it, and you have a transformative agenda where more social, cultural learning theories and more constructivist theories have a more definitive way of explaining learning behavior and learning outcomes, then it does pose a challenge. So, I'm with you that, it's a challenge, and I think it's the global agencies that need to come to the fore and acknowledge that this is an issue, and that would be the first step in trying to address it.
Thank you. No, I think that there I am still challenged, and eventually have not been succeeding too much in explaining the concept that we're using, because basically it's not our minimum proficiency level, it's not UNESCO, it's not global, it's not any, it is the one that is resulting from mapping and what the countries are reflecting in their own curriculum. So eventually we can argue, okay, this country copied to that other country, and then we end it in copying the curriculum of Germany or France or the United States, which not be ideal, but our exercise of mapping, when we went to the 120 countries, we found that they were very similar. We went to 150 or 155, I don't remember exactly the number. But then we were not gaining more information for adding more countries. So it was clear, for instance, that those were the levels. And to some extent, I also want to split that I don't consider that the framework or the proficiency level that are in peers, PISA teams, laboratory of UNESCO are reflecting any global standards, because these are the group of countries who define those assessment frameworks are the ones who are actually setting that. So saying that, I would insist that eventually we have to say the consensuated or the most prevalent level that is appearing in the curriculum of the countries. Then, if you have to see how much the child is learning at the end of second grade, you can assess in a group base, for instance, with questions which are relevant for your context in Latin America, which are relevant for the context in South Africa, or eventually you need to do it child by child as it is happening, because only child by child is that you are going to be able to understand, and this is a particular challenge in early grades, that there are assessments where are group which are adequate, for instance, for Spanish, which is a written language, apply in a region where in general there are 2 years of pre-primary education, where many of the children are already having very good understanding of reading and basic numeracy at the second year of the pre-primary, so when they reach third grade, they are perfectly able to read paragraph. And this is a different context in countries where still the pre-primary is not extended, where the languages are different and there are more oral tradition. For this reason, an oral assessment, which is trying to measure still the same skill in a different way, adequate to the context, is going to be the tool. And this is part of the challenge of the reporting. So I think that there, to some extent, the effort, at least in the right direction, we hope, but still doesn't seem to be fitting enough to what is perceived to be, is to try to see less as a global standard to more than a set of what is a result of the exercise of looking which are the most prevalent definitions, and leaving to each of the countries and situations actually the freedom to choose the language, the type of questions that even in this moment for early grades, the type of tool that you want and the method, the way to collect that data. Eventually, it doesn't mean that the psychometricians don't try to have an extra effort. But I think that also some of the issues that we have not discussed is about the data use and how much we are decodifying the results that are coming, right or wrong, that still has some value in the system to try to fit what teaching practices eventually are not happening, how we need to train the teachers. And then what we see is also that in general, in most of the teacher training programs, at least in the Global South, assessment and feedback. Assessment is a daily basis. At the end of the day, who promotes the student over a life cycle in the school is a teacher. And sometimes those teachers are not trained with the tools of how to evaluate a student by a student and give feedback and try to make the student grow. So I think that to some extent, eventually, we're not taking even imperfect, even not enough, the information we have to try to translate it into something that is valuable for making the student progress in their learning actually continue. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Silvia, and that's a really good point for the next steps as well that will take us further to really look at the outcomes and to see how can we contextualize that into the local systems and what do we learn from that to really help to improve educational outcomes. So I would like to thank again our presenters for today and every one of you for your participation, and please enjoy your lunchtime. Thank you very much.
Thank you, convener, discussant, and presenters. Please remain on stage for a token of appreciation. We would like to invite Professor Bambang Suryadi, PhD, to give the token to all presenters and convener of the symposium. Please stand in front of the table and to the center of the stage. And then let's take a photo together to the center of the stage. Three, two, one. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. You may return to your seat. And ladies and gentlemen, now we will take our lunch break. Please enjoy your lunch served at Kunyit restaurant. We invite you to return at 1:20 p.m. to continue our agenda. After this, you can choose to participate in either the parallel breakout sessions where participants will present the studies that's been accepted through the scientific committee's peer review, or stay in the ballroom to participate in more symposium sessions. You may scan the barcode on your ID badge for more information about the breakout session. And during your lunch break, you may also visit ACER Indonesia booth. This booth offers valuable insight and you may learn more about their important work in education. Selamat makan siang, bon appétit, enjoy your lunch break.